Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Uh, Today we're going to be tackling another Conspiracy Hunter series segment. This particular segment will be about the conspiracy that Paul McCartney actually died in 1966 and now a look-alike stands in his place. I know, sounds ridiculous, right? So we'll look into that a little bit more, and then we're going to be tackling the CIA's mind control experiments from the 1950s. So I've actually brought up two articles on that one. Now that one's not necessarily a conspiracy per se, because there's actually a lot of evidence behind that one. I was doing some other research. Not to say that every single part of that claim is true, but there is some truth behind a lot of those experiments actually taking place. So before we get started here, just please like and share and subscribe to this channel here and this video, and then hit the little notification tab to get notifications of any future videos so you don't miss any of mine. And I know some of mine are being pushed down by the algorithm stuff because the YouTube doesn't exactly like my some of the stuff I cover. So yeah, liking and sharing is definitely the best way to spread this and help support my work. The other way you can support is in the comments or the description down below. There's a little way to donate to support my work, since a lot of this stuff takes a lot of time, a lot of research, and a lot of work, and I don't have a marketing team to help me out or a production team. It's just me. So any little bit will help. Only do so if you feel led or you're able to. So without further ado, we'll get right into this. So Paul McCartney actually died in 1966, and now a look-alike stands in his place. Supposedly the other Beatles were in on the whole thing and helped to hire someone who looked, sounded, and acted just like him. But soon they began to feel guilty for lying and started hiding clues about his death in their music. So there's an article here about it. This was in 2019. Says some claim that the evidence is staring out from the cover of Abbey Road. So here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul. So Glass Onion, The Beatles, 1968. Did the Fab Four become a not quite so Fab Three in 1966? For half a century, there have been implacable advocates of this improbable theory. They are concerned that the real Paul McCartney is no longer with us, in body at any rate, having departed for the Celestial Hall of Fame in a car crash. Macca dead before the White Album. Ramifications are head spinning. Then who married Linda? Who sang Penny Lane? Who became Sir Paul McCartney, who was recently rocking out from his own kitchen? Well, wake up, sheeple. That guy giving you the thumbs up sign is not the real Sir James McCartney. Do you think the real Paul would have filmed for broadcast from his iPhone in portrait? Come on, that was fake Paul, or fall to those who refuse to be fooled. False rumor. On the night of January 7, 1967, a rumor swept London that Paul McCartney had been killed in a car crash on the M1. It became so widespread that in February 1967, issue of the Beatles book fanzine felt obliged to reassure worried fans. Stories about the Beatles are always flying around Fleet Street. The 7th January was very icy with dangerous conditions on the M1 motorway linking London with the Midlands, and towards the end of the day, a rumor swept London that Paul McCartney had been killed in a car crash on the M1. But of course, there was absolutely no truth in it at all, as the Beatles press officer found out when he telephoned Paul's St. John's Wood home and was answered by Paul himself, who had been at home all day with his black Mini Cooper safely locked up in the garage. Correction or cover-up? The article appeared to confirm that Macca was alive and kicking. With 3 more years of Beatle infighting to look forward to. The part was true, but the rest was inaccurate and misleading. This, as 60s folk like to say, is really what went down. McCartney's Mini Cooper was involved in an accident on the M1 motorway outside London, as a result of which it was written off. However, the car was being driven by a Moroccan student named Mohammed Hajij, and McCartney was not present. Hajij was an assistant to London art gallery owner Robert Fraser. The pair turned up at McCartney's house the evening of the 7 January. They were later joined by Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, and antiques dealer Christopher Gibbs. The party decided to head to Jagger's home in Hertfordshire. McCartney traveled with Jagger in the latter's Mini Cooper, while Hajij drove in McCartney's Mini. The two cars became separated during the journey. Hajij crashed McCartney's Mini and was hospitalized with injuries. The heavily customized car was highly recognizable. So rumors began circulating that McCartney had been killed in the accident. So far from being safely locked up in the garage, Paul's highly recognizable black Mini Cooper had been out on the town with his owner and some Rolling Stones. By the end of the night, it was a mangled wreck, and a mysterious young Moroccan was licking his wounds in accident and emergency. Meanwhile, the pop stars and Groovy Bob slipped quietly into the frosty night. Pretty low rent rock and roll hell-raising then. Enough, though, to raise eyebrows at Beatles HQ. The image of Paul McCartney tearing around London with the Rough Boys was not one they wanted circulated, hence the false rumors press release. The problem was that many witnesses had seen Paul's Mini that night. Well-founded rumors of a cover-up soon morphed into a new, much more elaborate conspiracy theory. This one again sent Paul to an early grave in a grisly car crash, but in a different McCartney-owned vehicle, his Austin Healey, and on an earlier date, November 9th, 1966. A technical problem with the second version was that Paul McCartney was out of the country on November 9th, 1966, enjoying a holiday with his then-girlfriend Jane Asher, and there weren't many icy roads in Kenya on which Paul could crash the Austin Healey he didn't take with him. Secret messages. On October 12th, 1969, a bizarre on-air phone call to Detroit radio station gave new life to the controversy. A caller, identified only as Tom, had some startling new information. He revealed that the Beatles had been sending secret messages through their recorded songs. Play Revolution 9 backwards, he said mysteriously, and you hear what I mean. The DJ duly spun the disc backwards, and somehow deciphering discordant wailing, he pronounced judgment. Wow, John is saying dead man. He's trying to tell us that Paul McCartney is dead. A week later, Michigan University student published an article, McCartney is dead. New evidence brought to light. The article built a pretty spooky, if not quite legally watertight, case for suspicious minds. Most famously, it drew attention to Paul crossing Abbey Road on the album Barefoot. And walking barefoot is, as everyone knows, a scientifically proven symbol of death. The clues in the album cover. The white VW Beetle in the background has a registration LMW28IF-28, or 28 being the age conspiracy theorists say McCartney would have been if he hadn't died. In fact, he was 27 when Abbey Road was released. In the background, a small group of people dressed in white stand on the side of the road, while a lone person stands in the other. Is this meant to be Paul, alone and different from the others? On the right-hand side of the road is a black police van, believed to be reference to the police who kept quiet about Paul's death. A line can be drawn from the right wheels of the cars on the left. This runs through Paul's head, suggesting he died of a head injury. Oh my goodness. And why does Paul have a cigarette in his right hand? Everyone knows Paul McCartney is left-handed. How do you explain that, eh? Then there's the number plate on the white Volkswagen Beetle LMW 28IF. Another message. Paul would have been 27 had he lived to record Abbey Road. Hard to argue with that, though a glance at Paul's birth certificate does reveal one of those technicalities that lawyers are so big on. Mr. McCartney was in fact 27 on the day he walked across Abbey Road, or didn't walk across. Paul is dead, clue number 16. On the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, there are 4 wax figures of the younger Beatles pre-Paul's death. The figures of Paul, George, and John are all the same height. But in the picture of them on the right, Paul is considerably taller than all of his bandmates. The wax figures were made to be specifications of the 1964 Beatles and reflect their analogous height in that era, while the picture on the right reflects the height difference between the original Paul and the fake. Must confess that I lack the expertise in advanced height studies to follow this logic. Tall story. Some skeptics have suggested that this evidence is a little fanciful. Believers counter with that what they consider a crucial forensic fact. Pre-death Paul was shorter than his imposter Fall. Of internet fact. Fall is taller than Paul. Of course, spoil sports quibble about camera angles and Cuban heels. Truth will out, though. Internet authenticated facts are stubborn things. Fake Paul. So who is this imposter Fall, who has been so skillfully impersonating Paul McCartney over the past 5 decades? Step forward, 1 William, or perhaps Mike. Fall experts diverge on this. Campbell. Apparently unreleased MI5 files prove that Brian Epstein secretly recruited Mr. Campbell, William or Mike, to step into Paul's shoes, or out of them on the Abbey Road cover after that fatal accident. William/Mike who? Oh yes, Mr. Campbell was the winner of the 1965 Paul McCartney lookalike competition. Evidently he also sang like Paul McCartney too, and wrote songs in the same style. Who would have thunk it? It's definitely a very, very long stretch to try and make. Okay, so now we're going to look at the CIA mind control. So the CIA undertook an intricate mind control program in the 1950s to force criminals into confessing. In the early 50s until 1973, the government experimented on people to develop procedures and drugs to be used in interrogations by forcing confessions and weakening the spirit of the person being tortured. Victims of the 1950s mind control experiments settled with CIA. So this was back in 1988. 30 years after the prominent Montreal psychiatrist performed a series of mind control experiments on patients, including giving them heavy doses of LSD. 7 of the former subjects yesterday reached a tentative settlement for damages with the CIA for its part in funding the doctor and his treatments. Sources said the former patients would receive a total of $750,000 if the settlement is approved by the Department of Justice. The sources said it is one of the largest amounts the CIA has ever agreed to pay, resulting from civil litigation. U.S. District Judge John Garrett Penn set a hearing this morning to review the proposed settlement. The tentative accord came on the eve of a civil trial that had been scheduled to begin today in federal court. The case was expected to dwell on what some CIA critics call one of the most shameful episodes in the agency's history: its involvement in the psychiatric practice of Dr. D. Ewan Cameron in the late 1950s. Cameron, who died in 1967, was a Scottish-born American who practiced at the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University in Montreal. From 1957 to 1961, he treated more than 50 patients who sought help for various psychological ailments, such as depression and anxiety. His goal was to reprogram behavior, and his methods caught the interest of CIA officials at the height of the Cold War. At the time, the intelligence agency was concerned with countering purported Soviet and Chinese breakthroughs in brainwashing and interrogation. In their day, Cameron's techniques were unusual. Today, they sound harrowing. To break the or depattern habits of personality traits, Cameron subjected his patients to drug-induced sleep therapy for weeks at a time, gave them LSD, and administered electroshock therapy up to 75 times the usual intensity. At the same time, Cameron sought to impel new behavior by having his patients listen to recorded messages playing continuously for days at a time, a practice known as psychic driving. He was inducing organic brain syndromes by damaging the central nervous system, reducing people to a zombie-like state, said James C. Turner, attorney for the 7 former patients and 1 widower of a patient who are suing the government. These are really horrific kinds of procedures, and the culmination is unheard of. Government lawyers have disputed that point in pleadings filed in federal court here. They argue that Cameron's techniques, though controversial, were not outside the bounds of accepted psychiatric practice in the late 1950s. Cameron, they stress, was one of the world's preeminent psychiatrists, a widely published scholar who was elected president of the American Psychiatric Association and the Canadian Psychiatric Association. Both before and after Cameron received $59,467 from a front organization funded by the CIA, he was awarded grants for his research from the Canadian government. Cameron's investigations were not dictated or controlled by the CIA in any way, and there is no evidence that he was ever aware that the CIA was the source of his funding. The government said Dr. Cameron was a well-meaning and well-motivated doctor who genuinely hoped he could relieve some of his patients' suffering. Nearly all the former patients now suing the government are elderly, and all say that their lives were impaired by Cameron's treatment. In a 1985 interview with the Washington Post, Velma Orlikow described what she said was the legacy of her treatment by Cameron, which included 14 shots of LSD as well as psychic driving. I suffer from chronic depression, which sometimes becomes acute, said Orlikow, the wife of a Canadian member of Parliament. I call these periods my black holes. I don't see anybody and I won't leave the house. I can't read, and I used to love to read. I can't write a letter. I have unexplained fears. I wake up at night afraid. I don't know why. I'm trying to limp through my life like someone who's been in a terrible accident that leaves them crippled. Orlikow and the other plaintiffs say they never consented to the specific treatments they received, nor were they told their cases were being used for research. The government said that Cameron's actions might be considered in their historical context. In the late 1950s, government lawyers contended it in court papers. The doctrine of informed consent, as it is now understood, did not exist. By having his patients sign a general consent form that did not specify treatments and methods, Cameron was following the dictates of medical ethics as they existed in Canada and the United States at the time, the government contended. The government further argued that there is no evidence that Cameron's patients were injured by the treatment they received. In any event, government lawyers said the CIA should not be found negligent because Cameron's program was underway before the CIA channeled money to him and after the funding stopped. Cameron was like an independent contractor, government lawyers argued. His actions were not guided or controlled by the CIA, and his decisions on treating patients were discretionary. As such, the government argued that they are not open to lawsuits under the Federal Tort Claims Act, but the former patients said the CIA should have known that the experiments were dangerous. They cited that now notorious case of Dr. Frank Olson, an army scientist whose after-dinner liqueur was secretly spiked with LSD by CIA agents in 1953 as part of the agency's brainwashing research program. That night, Olson jumped to his death from a 10th floor hotel room. The incident prompted an internal investigation at the CIA. More than 20 years later, President Ford apologized for Olson's death and signed legislation providing $750,000 to his survivors. Alice W. Olson, the scientist's widow, was scheduled to be the first witness for the plaintiffs in the trial that was to have started today. The former patient said it was the agency's responsibility to oversee Cameron's experiments, particularly because they entailed the use of LSD. The CIA's failure to do so, they say, amounts to negligence. The case is about whether an agency of this government should have allowed this thing to go forward when it was destructive to people, said Leonard S. Rubenstein, legal director of the Mental Health Law Project and an attorney for the former patients. The only real question is the CIA's legal guilt, said veteran civil rights lawyer Joseph Raw Jr., who handled the case until his retirement 7 years ago. The moral guilt is already admitted. Dr. Ewan Cameron used these methods to break or de-pattern habits and personality traits, used drug-induced sleep therapy for weeks at a time, administered LSD and electroshock therapy to up to 75 times the usual intensity, had patients listen to recorded messages playing continuously for days at a time, a practice known as psychic driving. So my take on this so far is there's definitely, nobody's denying that the experiments happened. The conspiracy part, I guess, would be the CIA's knowledge and their involvement in these tests. I have no doubt that the CIA still takes part in a lot of these kind of things, and the U.S. government does as well. It's just par for the course for these kind of spy agencies, but there's no way of knowing for sure whether they knew exactly what was going on, although I would wager a guess that they very likely did know what was going on, and find it very hard to believe that they did not. So let's see what the History Network has to say about this exact same thing. So they did this article, it doesn't say. On April 10th, 1953, Alan Dulles, the newly appointed director of the CIA, delivered a speech to a gathering of Princeton alumni. Though the event was mundane, global tensions were running high, the Korean War was coming to an end, and earlier that week the New York Times had published a startling story asserting that American POWs returning to the country may have been converted by communist brainwashers. So this is kind of... it kind of ties into the same thing, but it kind of takes out a little bit more in-depth look to it, which I would expect from the History Network. Some GIs were confessing to war crimes like carrying out germ warfare against the communists, a charge the U.S. categorically denied. Others were reportedly so brainwashed that they had refused to return to the United States at all. As if that weren't enough, the U.S. was weeks away from secretly sponsoring the overthrow of democratically elected leader of Iran. So I'm kind of glad that they point out that, it's not just the U.S. and Canada who have been kind of done this kind of stuff. They're pointing out that, these communist countries, they've kind of done a lot of the same thing, like during the Korean War there. I would wager probably the Vietnam War too. A lot of that was communist stuff there too. Dulles had just become the first civilian director of an agency growing more powerful by the day, and the speech provided an early glimpse into his priorities for the CIA. In the past few years, we have become accustomed to hearing much about the battle for men's minds, the war of ideologies, he told the attendees. I wonder, however, whether we clearly perceive the magnitude of the problem, whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become in Soviet hands, he continued. We might call it, in its new form, brain warfare. Yeah, Russia, I definitely have no doubt in my mind that they use that. I'm betting China's been using these kind of things for decades. especially with their concentration camps going on right now. I just horrified to think of what might be going on there. Dooley proceeded to describe the Soviet brain perversion techniques as effective but abhorrent and nefarious. He gestured to the American POWs returning from Korea, shells of the men they once were, parroting communist propaganda they had heard cycled for weeks on end. He expressed fears and uncertainty. Were they using chemical agents, hypnosis, something else entirely? We in the West, the CIA director conceded, are somewhat handicapped in brain warfare. This sort of non-consensual experiment, even on one's enemies, was antithetical to the sorry guys, I'm struggling today. To American values. Dooley insisted, as well as antithetical to what should be human values. Fear of brainwashing and a new breed of brain warfare terrified and fascinated the American public throughout the 1950s, spurred both by the words of the CIA and stories of brainwashed GIs returning from China, Korea, Soviet Union. Yeah, see there, China. Newspaper headlines like "New Evils Seen in Brainwashing" and "Brainwashing versus Western Psychiatry" offered sensational accounts on new mind control techniques and technologies that no man could fully resist. The paranoia began to drift into American culture. The books like The Manchurian Candidate and The Naked Lunch, I've never heard of The Naked Lunch before, playing on themes of unhinged scientists and vast political conspiracies. The idea of brainwashing has also provided many Americans with a compelling, almost comforting explanation for communist swift rise that Soviets use the tools of brainwashing not just on enemy combatants but on their own people. Why else would so many countries be embracing such an obviously backward ideology? American freedom of mind versus Soviet mind control became a dividing line as stark as the Iron Curtain. MK Ultra. 3 days after his speech decrying Soviet tactics, Dooley approved the beginning of MK Ultra, a top-secret CIA program for covert use of biological and chemical materials. American values made for good rhetoric, but Dooley's was had far grander plans for the agency's Cold War agenda. So this puts a little bit more stock behind the previous article we wrote, which was done in the 80s. MK Ultra's mind control experiments generally centered around behavior modification via electroshock therapy, hypnosis, polygraphs, radiation, a variety of drugs, toxins, and chemicals. These experiments relied on a range of test subjects who freely volunteered, some who volunteered under coercion, and some who had absolutely no idea they were involved in a sweeping defense research program. From mentally impaired boys at a state school to American soldiers to sexual psychopaths at a state hospital, MK Ultra's programs often preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. The CIA considered prisoners especially good subjects, as they were willing to give consent in exchange for extra recreation time or commuted sentences. Whitney Bulger, a former organized crime boss, wrote of his experience as an inmate test subject in MK Ultra. 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state. Bulger said of the 1957 tests at the Atlanta penitentiary when he was serving time: the total loss of appetite, hallucinating, the room would change shape, hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning to skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. Bulger claimed he had been injected with LSD, lysergic acid dithylamide, or acid, had become one of the CIA's key interests for its brain warfare program, as the agency theorized it could be useful in interrogations. In the late 1940s, the CIA received reports that the Soviet Union had engaged in intensive efforts to produce LSD, and the Soviets and that the Soviets had attempted to purchase the world's supply of the chemical. One CIA officer described the agency as literally terrified of the Soviets' LSD program, largely because of the lack of knowledge about the drug in the United States. This was the one material that we had never been able to locate that really had potential fantastic possibilities if used wrongly. The officer testified. With the advent of MK Ultra, the government's interest in LSD shifted from a defensive to an offensive orientation. Agency officials noted that LSD could be potentially useful in gaining control of bodies whether they were willing or not. The CIA envisioned applications that ranged from removing people from Europe in the case of a Soviet attack to enabling assassinations of enemy leaders. On November 18th, 1953, a group of 10 scientists met at a cabin located deep in the forests of Maryland. After extended discussions, the participants agreed that to truly understand the value of the drug, an unwitting experiment would be desirable. The CIA remained keenly aware of how the public would react to any discovery of MK Ultra, even if they believed these programs to be essential to national security. They must remain a tightly guarded secret. How would the CIA possibly explain dosing unassuming Americans with LSD? Precautions must be taken not only to protect operations from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American public in general, wrote the CIA's Inspector General in 1957. The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishment of its mission. Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA's initial experiments with LSD were fairly simple, if shockingly unethical. The agency generally dosed single targets, finding volunteers when they could, sometimes slipping the drug into the drinks of fellow CIA employees. Gee, great. Thanks for treating your employees with respect. Over time, these LSD experiments grew increasingly elaborate. Perhaps the most notorious of these projects was Operation Midnight Climax. In 1955, on 225 Chestnut Street, San Francisco, the CIA was devoting substantial attention to decorating a bedroom. George White oversaw the interior renovations. Not much of a decorator, White had a storied career in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. When the CIA moved into drug experiments, bringing White on board became a top priority. White hung up pictures of French can-can dancers and flowers. He draped lush red bedroom curtains over the windows. He framed a series of Toulouse-Lautrec posters with black silk mats. For a middle-aged drug bureaucrat, each item evoked sex and glamour. George White wasn't building a normal bedroom, he was building a trap. White then hired Berkeley engineering student to install bugging equipment and a two-way mirror. White sat behind the mirror, martini in hand, and waited for the action to begin. Prostitutes would lure unsuspecting Johns into the bedroom, where the men would be dosed with LSD and their actions observed by White from beyond the mirror. As payment for their services, the sex workers received small amounts of cash, as well as a guarantee from White that he'd intercede when the women inevitably had run-ins with law enforcement in the future. Though the CIA piloted these safe houses as a stage for testing the effects of LSD, White's interest shifted to another element of his observations: the sex. The San Francisco house became the center of what one writer called the CIA carnal operations. As officials began asking new questions about how to work with prostitutes, how they could be trained, how they would handle state secrets, the agency also analyzed when the course of a sexual encounter information could best be extracted from a source, eventually concluding that it was immediately after sex. But perhaps unsurprisingly, much of White's actions were driven by pure voyeurism. I told wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, White later said. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? Yeah, doesn't surprise me, that kind of morality out of someone participating in that. The CIA's experiments with LSD persisted until 1963 before coming to a fairly anticlimactic end. In the spring of 1963, John Vance, member of the CIA Inspector General staff, learned of the project's surprising surreptitious administration to unwitting non-voluntary human subjects. Though the MK Ultra directors tried to convince the CIA's independent audit board that the research should continue, the Inspector General insisted the agency follow new research ethics guidelines and bring all programs on non-consenting volunteers to an end. In 1977, Senator Edward Kennedy oversaw the congressional hearings investigating the effects of MK Ultra. Congress brought in a roster of ex-CIA employees for questioning, interrogating them about who oversaw these programs, how participants were identified, and if any of these programs had been continued. The hearings turned over a number of disturbing details, particularly about the 1953 suicide of Dr. Frank Olson, an Army scientist who jumped out of a hotel window several days after unwittingly consuming a drink spiked with LSD. Amid growing criminalization of drug users, and just a few years after President Nixon declared drug abuse as public enemy number one, the ironies of the U.S.'s troubling experimentation with drugs appeared in sharp relief. But throughout the hearings, Congress kept hitting roadblocks. CIA staffers claimed they couldn't remember details about many of the human experimentation projects, or even the number of people involved. The obvious next step would be to consult the records, but that presented a small problem. In 1973, amid mounting inquiries, the director of MK Ultra told workers it would be a good idea if the files were destroyed, citing vague concerns about the privacy and embarrassment of participants. The men who crafted MK Ultra effectively eradicated the paper record for one of the United States' most obviously illegal undertakings. A program born in secrecy would hold on to many of its secrets forever. Typical government to destroy all evidence of any wrongdoing that they participate in, which is kind of what the Trudeau government is trying to do right now in Canada. So, you kind of see the stark comparisons there. Not really too much of a conspiracy there. I don't have any problem believing anything that was in there, and there seems to be a lot of evidence backing up a lot of these claims that these people are making. So thanks for tuning in, guys. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and hit the little notification tabs. Thanks for watching.